Jintao, the leader who chose stability over reform. Part 1. The humble beginnings of a future leader. On December 21, 1942, in the midst of the Second Sino-Japanese War, Hu Jintao was born in Tai County, Jiangsu Province, an area under Japanese occupation at the time. His birth took place in a China gripped by conflict, a country divided between the Japanese-controlled puppet state and the resisting forces of the Chinese nationalists and communists. His early years were shaped by the challenges of wartime hardship and the social upheaval that followed in the years after Japan's surrender. Hu Jintao's family, though not destitute, belonged to the lower middle class, struggling to maintain stability in a period of significant political and economic change. His father, Hu Jingji, was a small tea merchant running a modest trading business in Taizhou. While the enterprise provided a livelihood, it did not afford the family the wealth or influence that many successful businessmen of the time enjoyed. His mother, a teacher, was known for her intelligence and dedication to education, but tragically, she passed away when Hu Jintao was only 7 years old. This early loss had a profound impact on him, forcing him to mature quickly and shaping his reserved and introspective personality. Left without a mother's nurturing presence, young Hu was raised primarily by his aunt, who took on the responsibility of his care. The family's ancestral roots traced back to Jixi County, Anhui Province, but they had migrated to Taizhou in previous generations. Interestingly, Hu Jintao was a direct descendant of Hu Zongxian, a Ming dynasty general renowned for his valiant efforts in resisting Japanese pirates along the eastern coast of China. This lineage of disciplined military leadership and service to the nation may have instilled in Hu a deep-seated sense of duty and patriotism, values that would define his later political career. Despite the economic struggles of his family, Hu was a diligent and exceptionally bright student. He excelled in his studies and displayed remarkable discipline from an early age. He attended Taizhou No. 1 High School, where his academic prowess became evident. Teachers and classmates alike noted his ability to memorize texts quickly, a skill that reportedly remained with him throughout his life. It was during these formative years that Hu developed an interest in engineering and science, fields that would later guide his academic and professional trajectory. The political climate of China during Hu's youth was turbulent. The Chinese Civil War between the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, and the nationalist Kuomintang, KMT, raged on until the CCP's eventual victory in 1949. As a young boy growing up during this era of immense change, Hu would have witnessed firsthand the sweeping transformations in Chinese society as Mao Zedong's new government embarked on its socialist reconstruction of the country. The ideological currents of the time, emphasizing collectivism, discipline, and national unity, would later shape his own leadership style. In 1959, Hu Jintao's academic excellence earned him a place at Tsinghua University, one of China's most prestigious institutions. He was admitted to the university's Water Conservancy Engineering Department, where he specialized in hydropower stations, a field in high demand as the communist government sought to modernize China's infrastructure. Tsinghua was known not only for its rigorous academic standards, but also as a breeding ground for future political leaders. Many of China's top officials, including several of Hu's predecessors and successors, were trained at Tsinghua. During his university years, Hu distinguished himself as an exceptionally disciplined and hardworking student. His sharp intellect and methodical approach to problem-solving won him the admiration of both professors and peers. However, his time at Tsinghua was not solely defined by academic pursuits. As was expected of students during this era, Hu became involved in political activities, aligning himself with the values of the Chinese Communist Party. In April 1964, at the age of 21, Hu Jintao joined the CCP, marking the beginning of his lifelong political career. This was a crucial moment in his life, as it demonstrated not only his commitment to the communist cause, but also his willingness to navigate the complex political landscape of the time. The decision to join the party was strategic. Those who actively participated in party affairs had greater opportunities for advancement, both in academia and in their professional careers. After graduating in 1965, Hu remained at Tsinghua University as a political counselor, a position that reflected his growing involvement in party-related work. This role required him to guide and educate younger students in the ideological principles of the Communist Party, reinforcing loyalty to the party's leadership and policies. Just as Hu was beginning his career, China was plunged into the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, 1966-1976, a decade-long period of political purges, mass upheaval, and ideological struggle initiated by Mao Zedong. The revolution targeted intellectuals, academics, and anyone perceived to be counter-revolutionary. During this period, Hu Jintao, like many others, was sent to work in the countryside as part of Mao's campaign to re-educate urban youth through manual labor. Hu's father, despite being a small businessman with no strong political ties, was denounced during the Cultural Revolution, a traumatic event that reportedly had a deep impact on Hu. The younger Hu, however, remained cautious and avoided any public displays of dissent. Instead, he focused on his work, determined to prove his loyalty to the party. This experience likely reinforced his tendency toward political caution, discretion, and an aversion to personal controversy, traits that would characterize his leadership style in later years. In 1968, Hu was assigned to work on the construction of the Liujiaxia hydroelectric station in Gansu province as part of China's Third Front campaign, which aimed to develop industries in the country's remote interior to strengthen national security. This was an era of nationalistic fervor, where young, educated professionals were expected to contribute to the economic and industrial development of China. Hu threw himself into the work, displaying the diligence and technical expertise that would earn him recognition. During this period, he also managed CCP affairs for the local branch of the Ministry of Water Resources and Electric Power. His work in Gansu over the next several years would prove to be an important stepping stone in his political career, providing him with practical administrative experience and exposing him to the workings of the party at a grassroots level. In 1970, Hu married Liu Yongqing, whom he had met during their time at Tsinghua University. Liu, like Hu, was a reserved and private individual who largely stayed out of the political spotlight. Together, they had two children, Hu Haifeng and Hu Haixing. Unlike some other prominent Chinese political families, Hu kept his family life strictly private, and his children did not play visible roles in the political arena. Despite his increasing involvement in party affairs, Hu Jintao remained an enigmatic figure, rarely granting interviews or making personal statements. Even his hobbies, table tennis and ballroom dancing, offered little insight into his character. However, his photographic memory, which had been evident since high school, remained one of his defining attributes, allowing him to quickly absorb and recall vast amounts of information, a skill that would later serve him well in high-stakes political meetings. By the early 1970s, Hu had begun to rise through the ranks of the party, proving himself to be a competent administrator with a talent for navigating China's complex political landscape. His early life experiences, his humble origins, his exposure to the ideological struggles of the Cultural Revolution, and his technical training in engineering had shaped him into a disciplined, pragmatic, and cautious political figure. As he moved forward in his career, these traits would define his leadership style, setting the stage for his future as one of China's most influential leaders. Part 2. Early political career and rise in Gansu. By the early 1970s, Hu Jintao had established himself as a disciplined and diligent party member, navigating China's turbulent political landscape with care. His work as an engineer and administrator in Gansu province provided him with invaluable experience in both technical and organizational matters. However, it was his ability to remain politically cautious while proving his competence that allowed him to rise steadily within the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Gansu, a vast and underdeveloped region in northwestern China, was a challenging environment for any ambitious official. The province was plagued by harsh geography, with large desert expanses, extreme weather conditions, and a largely rural population struggling with poverty. The region had been designated as a key site for the Third Front campaign, a massive government initiative aimed at developing heavy industries in China's interior to reduce dependence on coastal cities in case of war. Working under such conditions required resilience, adaptability, and, most importantly, the ability to align oneself with the shifting political winds of the CCP. Hu Jintao had initially been assigned to Gansu in 1968 as part of his work with the Ministry of Water Resources and Electric Power. Over the next several years, he immersed himself in the party's administrative apparatus, proving his capabilities in both engineering and political affairs. His superiors took note of his work ethic, as well as his ability to navigate political sensitivities without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. In 1973, Hu received his first formal political appointment when he was transferred to the Gansu Construction Department as a secretary. This role placed him within the bureaucracy of the provincial government and allowed him to cultivate relationships with senior party officials. Unlike many of his peers who often relied on personal connections or family influence to rise within the party, Hu ascended largely through his technical expertise, discipline, and careful political maneuvering. His political fortunes took a significant turn in 1974 when he was promoted to deputy senior party secretary in the Gansu provincial government. This was a major step up for a relatively young official, signaling that he had been identified as a promising talent within the party. His promotion coincided with a broader shift in the CCP's strategy for grooming future leaders. Deng Xiaoping and other senior figures were beginning to emphasize the need for a new generation of cadre who were more revolutionary, younger, more knowledgeable, and more specialized. It was during this period that Hu Jintao came to the attention of Song Ping, the powerful first secretary of the CCP Gansu Committee. Song, an influential figure within the party's organization department, played a key role in selecting and promoting young talent. He was impressed by Hu's diligence, intelligence, and political caution, traits that would define Hu's leadership style for the rest of his career. Song Ping became Hu's most important political patron, setting the stage for his rapid rise. Recognizing Hu's potential, Song recommended him for further promotion, and by 1980, Hu had been appointed deputy head of the Gansu Provincial Construction Commission. This position placed him in charge of overseeing major infrastructure projects, further developing his expertise in economic planning and state-led development. By this time, Deng Xiaoping had consolidated his control over the CCP and launched sweeping economic reforms aimed at modernizing China. Deng's four modernization strategy prioritized agriculture, industry, science and technology, and defense, marking a clear departure from the ideological excesses of the Maoist era. While Hu Jintao had no personal role in shaping these policies, his technical background and administrative experience positioned him as an ideal candidate to implement them at the local level. In 1982, Hu Jintao took on a new challenge when he was appointed secretary of the Gansu branch of the Communist Youth League, CYL, the organization responsible for cultivating young Communist Party leaders. The CYL had long served as a breeding ground for future party elites, and Hu's appointment to this role signaled that he was being groomed for higher office. The following year, he was also named director of the All China Youth Federation, further expanding his influence within the party's youth apparatus. The significance of Hu's time in the Communist Youth League cannot be overstated. The CYL was not just an organization for young people. It was a crucial institution within the CCP that shaped the political outlook and careers of future party leaders. By leading the CYL in Gansu, Hu had the opportunity to build a personal network of allies and supporters, many of whom would later rise to prominence alongside him. However, Hu's rise was not solely the result of his competence and loyalty. He also benefited from the direct patronage of powerful figures within the party. Hu Yaobang, the party's general secretary and a key advocate for political reform, took notice of Hu Jintao's work in the CYL and became another important supporter. Unlike many senior leaders of the time, Hu Yaobang believed in promoting young, reform-minded officials who were free from the ideological baggage of the Maoist era. At the suggestion of Song Ping, who had been transferred to Beijing as Minister of Organization of the CCP, Hu Jintao was invited to study at the Central Party School in 1982. This was a crucial opportunity. Attendance at the Central Party School was often a prerequisite for those destined for higher leadership roles. During his time there, Hu deepened his understanding of party ideology, political strategy, and governance. The training he received further solidified his credentials as a rising star within the CCP. In 1984, Hu Jintao was transferred to Beijing and appointed to the Secretariat of the Communist Youth League Central Committee, a powerful position that placed him at the heart of the party's youth organization. Just 2 years later, in 1986, he was promoted to first secretary of the CYL, making him the organization's top leader. This was a pivotal moment in his career, as it firmly established him as one of the most promising young politicians in China. Hu Yaobang, then General Secretary of the CCP, frequently took Hu Jintao on visits across China, providing him with valuable exposure to different regions and their unique challenges. These trips were not merely ceremonial, they were opportunities for Hu to learn firsthand about governance, economic planning, and social policies. For Hu Yaobang, who had himself risen through the Communist Youth League, Hu Jintao was a reflection of the kind of leaders he wanted to promote: young, capable, and untainted by the ideological struggles of the past. Despite his meteoric rise, Hu Jintao remained remarkably low profile. Unlike other ambitious officials, he rarely voiced strong opinions in public or sought the limelight. He was careful to align himself with party orthodoxy, avoiding any controversial positions that could jeopardize his career. This cautious approach would later serve him well, especially as political tensions within the CCP escalated in the late 1980s. By the end of the 1980s, Hu Jintao had firmly established himself as a key figure in China's political landscape. He had risen from a provincial official in Gansu to the leader of the Communist Youth League, gaining the trust of influential party elders along the way. However, his true test was yet to come. As China faced growing unrest and political challenges, Hu would soon be thrust into an even more demanding role, one that would test his leadership, adaptability, and loyalty to the party. Part 3. Leadership in Guizhou and Tibet. A test of authority. By the mid-1980s, Hu Jintao had already distinguished himself as a rising star within the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. His rapid ascent from a provincial administrator in Gansu to the national leadership of the Communist Youth League, CYL, was a testament to his discipline, adaptability, and ability to navigate China's complex political system. However, his leadership would soon be tested in two of China's most challenging regions, Guizhou and Tibet. Governor of Guizhou, leading a struggling province. In 1985, Hu Jintao was transferred from Beijing to Guizhou province, where he was appointed as the party committee secretary, effectively making him the most powerful official in the province. This appointment was significant. It was the first time Hu was given full authority over a region, marking a crucial step in his political career. The move also aligned with the CCP's strategy of testing future national leaders by assigning them to govern less developed areas before promoting them to higher offices. Guizhou, a remote and impoverished province in southwestern China, was one of the most economically backward regions in the country. The rugged terrain, limited infrastructure, and high population of ethnic minorities posed serious challenges to development. The province had long struggled with underinvestment, food shortages, and widespread poverty. Given these obstacles, Hu's appointment was not merely a promotion. It was also a formidable test of his ability to implement party policies in difficult conditions. Unlike some party officials who sought to implement drastic economic reforms, Hu took a cautious and pragmatic approach to governance in Guizhou. He placed great emphasis on economic development, but rather than pushing for aggressive modernization, he focused on incremental improvements, such as expanding infrastructure and improving agricultural productivity. Hu was known for his meticulous work ethic and frequently traveled across the province to understand the conditions in each locality. He reportedly visited all 86 counties in Guizhou during his tenure, an impressive feat that showcased his commitment to grassroots governance. At the same time, Hu carefully maintained political stability in the province. In the wake of the democracy wall movement in Beijing, Guizhou's student population had become increasingly vocal, calling for reforms and greater political freedoms. While protests and pro-democracy sentiments emerged, Hu ensured that dissent remained controlled and did not escalate into a broader political movement. Unlike some other provincial leaders who resorted to outright repression, Hu opted for a more controlled and cautious approach, ensuring that social unrest was contained without excessive force. However, despite his efforts, Hu's time in Guizhou was not universally popular. Some locals viewed his tenure as unremarkable, noting that he did not bring radical economic changes. His predecessor, Zhu Haozu, had been more outspoken and reformist, earning favor among students and intellectuals. Hu, by contrast, remained reserved and tightly aligned with party directives, making him a figure of political stability rather than one of dramatic change. Nevertheless, Hu's time in Guizhou solidified his credentials as a disciplined and reliable administrator. He had demonstrated that he could maintain order, implement gradual economic improvements, and navigate the tensions between reformist and conservative factions within the party. These qualities would soon be put to the test on a far more challenging stage, Tibet. A controversial role in Tibet. In 1988, Hu Jintao was transferred to the Tibet Autonomous Region, where he was appointed as the party secretary, the highest-ranking political official in the region. This appointment was a major escalation in responsibility and placed Hu in charge of one of China's most politically sensitive and volatile regions. Tibet, with its distinct ethnic and religious identity, had long been a source of tension between Beijing and Tibetan nationalists who sought greater autonomy or outright independence. Hu's arrival in Tibet coincided with a period of growing unrest. Since the 1959 Tibetan uprising and the flight of the 14th Dalai Lama to India, tensions had simmered between the Chinese government and Tibetan activists. While Beijing had attempted to modernize the region and integrate it more closely with the rest of China, many Tibetans remained deeply resentful of Han Chinese rule, seeing it as an attack on their cultural and religious traditions. By the late 1980s, this frustration boiled over into open protests. In October 1987, monks and laypeople in Lhasa took to the streets to demand greater autonomy and religious freedom. These protests, inspired in part by international attention to Tibet, were met with a harsh crackdown by Chinese security forces. When Hu Jintao assumed office in 1988, he inherited an already volatile situation. The most defining moment of Hu's tenure in Tibet came on March 5, 1989, when large-scale riots erupted in Lhasa. Tibetan protesters clashed with Chinese police, setting fire to government buildings, attacking police officers, and chanting slogans in favor of Tibetan independence. The violence quickly spiraled out of control, threatening to undermine Beijing's grip on the region. In response, Hu declared martial law on March 8, 1989, effectively placing Tibet under military control. Thousands of People's Liberation Army (PLA) troops were deployed to Lhasa to restore order. The crackdown was swift and brutal. Security forces arrested hundreds of protesters, imposed strict curfews, and increased surveillance throughout the region. While the Chinese government framed these actions as necessary to restore stability, human rights groups widely condemned the repression, accusing Beijing of using excessive force against Tibetan civilians. The international backlash against China's actions in Tibet was severe. Foreign governments and human rights organizations criticized the crackdown, with many calling for greater autonomy for Tibetans. The Dalai Lama, who had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize later that year, used his global platform to highlight the plight of his people, further increasing pressure on Beijing. However, within the CCP, Hu's handling of the situation was viewed favorably. His ability to swiftly suppress unrest without allowing the situation to escalate into a prolonged crisis won him the approval of Deng Xiaoping and other top leaders. His reputation as a tough, disciplined enforcer was solidified, and he was seen as someone who could be trusted to manage politically sensitive situations with an iron grip. Moreover, Hu's actions in Tibet set a precedent for how the CCP would handle ethnic unrest in the years to come. The strategy of combining military force with tight political control, a model later seen in regions like Xinjiang, was reinforced during Hu's tenure. His ability to suppress dissent while maintaining an image of calm, technocratic governance became a hallmark of his leadership style. The path to national leadership. By the time Hu left Tibet in 1992, he had proven himself to be a capable administrator, a disciplined enforcer, and a leader who could be trusted to uphold party control in difficult situations. His handling of Tibet had earned him the attention of China's highest-ranking officials, and he was seen as a strong candidate for further promotion. Moreover, his ability to maintain a low profile despite the highly controversial events in Tibet reinforced his reputation as a cautious and pragmatic politician. Unlike some of his contemporaries who did not seek personal recognition or media attention, he focused purely on executing party directives, a trait that would serve him well in the years to come. Shortly after leaving Tibet, Hu was elevated to the Politburo Standing Committee, China's most powerful decision-making body. At the age of 49, he became one of the youngest members of the committee, marking him as a clear successor to China's top leadership. As he stepped onto the national stage, Hu carried with him the lessons of Guizhou in Tibet, maintaining political stability, enforcing party authority, and managing crises with caution and control. These experiences would shape his approach to governance when he eventually assumed power as China's paramount leader. Part 4, Rise to Power, the Path to China's Leadership. By 1992, Hu Jintao had firmly established himself as a rising political star within the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. His tenure in Guizhou had demonstrated his administrative competence, while his time in Tibet had showcased his ability to enforce party control in politically sensitive regions. His careful discipline and low-profile approach to leadership had caught the attention of China's top figures, particularly Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Song Ping, the influential party elder who had mentored him since his days in Gansu. With these credentials, Hu Jintao was now poised for the biggest leap in his career, entry into China's national leadership. At just 49 years old, he would soon become one of the youngest members of the Politburo Standing Committee (PSC), the country's most powerful decision-making body. However, his rise to prominence did not come without challenges. China was undergoing significant political and economic transformations, and Hu had to navigate the complex dynamics of the party's power structure carefully. The 14th National Congress and Politburo Standing Committee appointment, 1992. In October 1992, at the 14th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, a historic leadership transition was underway. Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader who had guided China's economic reforms, was stepping back from active leadership, paving the way for a new generation of leaders. While Jiang Zemin had already been established as the General Secretary of the CCP and designated successor to Deng, the party still needed to ensure long-term political stability by selecting the next generation of leaders who would eventually take over after Jiang. Deng Xiaoping and other senior leaders, including Chen Yun, were tasked with selecting candidates for the Politburo Standing Committee, PSC. During these discussions, Deng proposed that one of the committee members should be from a younger generation, ensuring continuity beyond Jiang's tenure. The goal was to groom a fourth-generation leader, someone who could take over in the early 2000s after Jiang Zemin's administration had run its course. At the recommendation of Song Ping, Hu Jintao emerged as the ideal candidate. He was young, politically reliable, and had a proven track record in handling both administrative and crisis situations. More importantly, he was untainted by factional struggles, making him a neutral figure who could maintain party unity. As a result, Hu Jintao was appointed to the Politburo Standing Committee, PSC, becoming the youngest member at just 49 years old. His rise was extraordinary. He had bypassed many senior officials who had been waiting for promotions and was now firmly on track to become China's future leader. Hu's appointment to the PSC marked the beginning of his ascendancy to national leadership. However, despite his new position, he remained relatively low profile. Unlike other high-ranking officials who sought to project authority through public speeches and media appearances, Hu maintained his reputation as a cautious and disciplined technocrat, entrusted with key roles, secretariat and party school leadership. Following his elevation to the Politburo Standing Committee, Hu was given several important responsibilities that solidified his role as a key figure in China's leadership structure. First Secretary of the Central Secretariat, Hu was appointed as First Secretary of the Secretariat of the CCP, a crucial position overseeing day-to-day operations of the party's Central Committee. This role placed him at the heart of the party's administrative machinery and allowed him to build relationships with top party cadres and provincial leaders. President of the Central Party School. In 1993, Hu was appointed president of the Central Party School, the institution responsible for training and ideologically educating party officials. This was a strategic appointment as it allowed him to cultivate a network of allies among the party's rising bureaucrats. Many officials who attended the school during Hu's tenure would later become key figures in his administration. Through these positions, Hu Jintao became deeply embedded in the party's ideological, administrative, and policy-making structures. While he remained overshadowed by Jiang Zemin, he steadily built his influence within the party's bureaucratic system, the heir apparent, positioned for leadership. Despite his rapid rise, Hu was careful never to overshadow Jiang Zemin. He maintained a modest, non-confrontational demeanor, always positioning himself as a loyal servant of the party rather than an ambitious power seeker. This approach allowed him to avoid political conflicts. Unlike previous designated successors such as Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, who had fallen out of favor due to political disagreements. Unlike Jiang, who had built a power base among Shanghai-based officials, the Shanghai clique, Hu had no strong factional affiliations. This neutrality made him a palatable choice for both reformists and conservatives within the party. His lack of a personal faction meant that he was perceived as a consensus candidate, someone who could maintain party unity without being seen as a threat to any particular group. Throughout the 1990s, Hu continued to solidify his reputation as a competent administrator, but he did not introduce major political reforms or challenge the existing system. His focus remained on executing party policies efficiently and ensuring political stability. This approach reassured the party elite that he was a safe choice to take over from Jiang in the future. By the late 1990s, it had become increasingly clear that Hu Jintao was being groomed to become China's next leader. While Jiang Zemin still held supreme authority, Hu was seen as his eventual successor, expected to take over in the early 2000s. However, the transition of power would not be immediate. Jiang intended to retain influence even after stepping down from his official positions. Vice presidency and increasing influence, 1998-2002. In 1998, Hu was appointed as Vice President of China, a largely ceremonial position, but one that further reinforced his status as heir apparent. As Vice President, Hu began to play a more active role in foreign affairs, representing China on diplomatic visits and attending international summits. This role allowed him to gain experience in global politics and diplomacy, which would become crucial once he assumed full leadership. Hu also became involved in overseeing China's national security and internal stability, particularly in regions prone to unrest, such as Tibet and Xinjiang. His previous experience in Tibet had demonstrated his ability to handle ethnic conflicts, and he continued to advocate for tight control over separatist movements and religious dissent. During this period, Jiang Zemin sought to maintain his grip on power, even as Hu's leadership role became more visible. Jiang launched several ideological campaigns, such as the Three Represents theory, which sought to redefine the CCP's role to include business elites and private entrepreneurs. Hu, as always, remained cautious and avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to publicly support Jiang's policies while quietly preparing for the transition of power. The 16th National Congress and Leadership Transition, 2002. By 2002, it was finally time for China's next leadership transition. At the 16th National Congress of the CCP, Hu Jintao was officially named General Secretary of the Communist Party, taking over from Jiang Zemin. This marked the beginning of Hu's tenure as China's paramount leader. though Jiang still retained influence, particularly as chairman of the Central Military Commission, CMC. While Jiang had stepped down as general secretary and president, his faction, the Shanghai clique, still controlled many positions in the government. As a result, Hu did not immediately consolidate power. Instead, he had to gradually assert his authority, a process that would take several years. With Hu's accession to power, China officially entered the era of collective leadership, where major decisions were made through consensus rather than by a single dominant leader. This leadership style contrasted with the strongman rule of previous figures like Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, and it defined much of Hu's tenure. The dawn of a new era, Hu Jintao's rise to power was unlike that of his predecessors. He had carefully avoided factional struggles, built a reputation for discipline and pragmatism, and maintained party unity. While he lacked the charismatic presence of Mao or Deng, he was seen as a competent and steady leader who could continue China's economic growth while ensuring political stability. As he took the reins of leadership in 2002, the world watched to see what kind of leader Hu Jintao would become. Would he introduce political reforms? Would he continue Jiang's pro-business policies? Or would he chart a new course for China? These questions would soon be answered as Hu Jintao began his tenure as China's paramount leader. Part 5. The early years of Hu Jintao's leadership in the struggle for control, 2002-2005. When Hu Jintao assumed the position of General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, on November 15, 2002, he inherited a nation that had undergone more than 2 decades of rapid economic reform and modernization under Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin. China had become a rising economic powerhouse, with its GDP growing at an astonishing pace, urbanization expanding rapidly, and globalization integrating the country into the world economy. However, beneath this progress, deep structural issues remained: widening income inequality, rampant corruption, environmental degradation, and growing unrest among marginalized social groups. Despite officially being China's new paramount leader, Hu did not immediately have full control over the government and military. His predecessor, Jiang Zemin, still wielded significant influence through his continued chairmanship of the Central Military Commission, CMC, as well as through his loyalists in the Politburo Standing Committee, PSC, and other key government institutions. Jiang's Shanghai clique, a faction consisting of officials he had promoted during his tenure, continued to dominate the political landscape. This meant that Hu's early years in power were marked by a delicate balancing act, where he had to consolidate his authority without directly challenging Jiang's influence. A power struggle behind closed doors, Jiang's lingering influence. Unlike Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin was not willing to fully retire upon handing over leadership to Hu Jintao. Although Jiang had formally stepped down as General Secretary of the CCP, he retained his position as chairman of the CMC, allowing him to control China's military, a powerful tool that could be used to shape domestic and foreign policies. This move effectively curtailed Hu's ability to implement independent policies, forcing him to rule within the boundaries set by Jiang's lingering authority. Moreover, 6 out of the 9 members of the new Politburo Standing Committee, PSC, were Jiang loyalists, making it difficult for Hu to push through any major policy changes without negotiation and compromise. This structure of leadership, a divided top leadership between Hu and Jiang's faction, led to an era of what was called collective leadership, in which power was shared among different factions rather than concentrated in one leader. Hu, known for his patient and pragmatic political style, chose not to openly confront Jiang. Instead, he adopted a long-term strategy of gradually building his own influence while waiting for Jiang's grip on power to loosen. This would take 2 years of quiet maneuvering before Hu could truly begin to govern on his own terms. The challenge of the SARS crisis, 2003, Hu's first major test. One of Hu Jintao's first major challenges as China's leader came in early 2003, when the country was suddenly confronted with the outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS. The deadly virus, which originated in southern China, quickly spread to Hong Kong, Beijing, and other parts of the country, threatening public health and economic stability. At the time, China's health authorities, many of whom were still under Jiang Zemin's influence, initially tried to suppress information about the outbreak, leading to delays in public warnings and containment measures. When reports of SARS began emerging internationally, the Chinese government was widely criticized for its lack of transparency and mismanagement of the crisis. Faced with mounting domestic and international pressure, Hu took decisive action. In April 2003, he ordered a complete shift in the government's handling of the outbreak, implementing a nationwide emergency response. He also dismissed two senior officials closely linked to Jiang. Health Minister Zhang Wenkang, accused of covering up the extent of the SARS outbreak. Beijing Mayor Meng Xuanong, criticized for failing to contain the spread of the virus in the capital. These dismissals were the first public signs of Hu asserting his authority over Jiang's allies. By taking charge of the SARS response, Hu demonstrated his leadership capabilities and won praise for prioritizing public health over political loyalty. The epidemic was eventually contained, but the crisis had exposed deep flaws in China's governance, particularly the lack of transparency in decision-making. For Hu, the SARS crisis was both a test and an opportunity. He had successfully distinguished himself from Jiang's leadership style, proving that he was capable of handling national emergencies decisively. However, the struggle for full control was far from over. The slow but steady transition of power, 2003-2004. Following the SARS crisis, Hu gradually worked to strengthen his position within the party, government, and military. In March 2003, he formally became president of China, taking over the state leadership from Jiang. However, his real challenge remained, securing control over the military. For the next year, Hu Jintao carefully built alliances within the People's Liberation Army, PLA. He strengthened ties with military leaders who were more aligned with his vision of governance while avoiding direct conflict with Jiang's faction. His patience eventually paid off. In September 2004, Jiang Zemin was finally forced to resign as chairman of the Central Military Commission, CMC, formally handing over military control to Hu Jintao. This moment marked the true transition of power, as Hu now controlled all three pillars of leadership in China. General Secretary of the CCP, 2002, Party Leadership. President of China, 2003, Head of State. Chairman of the Central Military Commission, 2004, Military Control. With Jiang's retirement, Hu Jintao was now, for the first time, China's undisputed paramount leader. However, even though Jiang had stepped down, his influence within the party remained strong. His faction, the Shanghai clique, still controlled many key positions in the government, particularly in economic policymaking and propaganda. This meant that Hu could not completely overhaul Jiang-era policies and had to govern through negotiation and compromise. Hu's early leadership style, modesty, stability, and consensus rule. As Hu Jintao consolidated power, he set himself apart from his predecessors by adopting a modest and low-key leadership style. Unlike Jiang Zemin, who had a more flamboyant and personalistic approach to governance, Hu focused on collective leadership and consensus-based decision-making. Several characteristics defined Hu's governing approach: scientific development concept and a shift to social welfare. Hu emphasized the need for balanced economic growth that would address rural poverty, social inequality, and environmental issues. His concept of a harmonious socialist society aimed to reduce class tensions and create a more equitable distribution of wealth, avoiding personality cults. Unlike Mao and Deng, Hu did not seek to establish a personal cult of leadership. He preferred a bureaucratic and technocratic style of governance, focusing on administrative efficiency rather than ideological dominance. Tightening political control. While Hu sought economic and social stability, he also reinforced the party's authority by suppressing dissent, internet freedom, and political activism. His government intensified censorship and crackdowns on social disturbances, such as Tibetan and Uyghur protests. Hu's early years as leader were marked by a mix of economic pragmatism, controlled political reforms, and strong central authority. However, as he continued his tenure, he would face even greater challenges, both domestically and internationally. The beginning of Hu's era. By 2005, Hu Jintao had successfully transitioned into full leadership, overcoming Jiang Zemin's lingering influence. He had handled his first major national crisis, SARS, consolidated control over the military, and introduced new economic and social policies aimed at balancing China's rapid growth with social stability. However, the true test of his leadership was yet to come. Over the next years, he would have to manage China's economic rise, domestic unrest, and an increasingly complex international environment. Part 6. Economic Expansion, Social Reforms, and Foreign Policy Challenges. 2005-2008. By 2005, Hu Jintao had fully consolidated his power, officially taking full control of the party, state, and military. He was now China's undisputed paramount leader, overseeing a nation that had transformed into a global economic powerhouse. However, along with China's growing economic strength came pressing domestic issues and increasing international scrutiny. During this period, Hu Jintao sought to balance economic expansion with social equity, maintain political stability, and expand China's influence on the global stage. His policies reflected a shift from the pro-business, export-driven focus of Jiang Zemin's era to a more state-controlled, welfare-oriented economic model. Economic policies balancing growth with equity. Under Hu's leadership, China continued its remarkable economic growth, averaging nearly 10% GDP growth annually. However, Hu recognized that the benefits of rapid development were not evenly distributed. Rural areas, migrant workers, and lower-income citizens were being left behind. Unlike Jiang Zemin, who prioritized business-friendly policies and private sector expansion, Hu introduced a more populist economic agenda focused on reducing inequality and increasing social welfare. 1. The Scientific Development Concept, SDC. Hu introduced the Scientific Development Concept, SDC, as a guiding economic philosophy. This concept emphasized balanced, sustainable, and people-centered development, marking a shift from Jiang's pro-business approach to a model focused on social stability and environmental protection. Key aspects of the SDC included reducing the gap between urban and rural development, improving education and healthcare access for the poor, promoting sustainable development and environmental protection, strengthening state-owned enterprises, SOEs, while limiting private sector expansion. Hu's approach reasserted state control over key sectors, including energy, banking, and telecommunications, reversing some of the privatization policies initiated under Jiang. State-owned enterprises, SOEs, received greater government subsidies, consolidating their dominance over China's economy. 2. Expansion of social welfare programs. Hu launched several major social initiatives aimed at improving the lives of lower-income citizens. Abolition of the agricultural tax, 2006. The agricultural tax, which had been in place for over 2,600 years, was abolished under Hu's leadership. This policy relieved financial burdens on farmers, improving rural incomes. Expansion of rural healthcare, 2005-2008. Hu's government introduced a new cooperative medical insurance system for rural residents. By 2008, more than 90% of rural Chinese had access to basic healthcare. Minimum wage and worker protections, 2007 labor contract law. A new labor contract law strengthened worker protections and required companies to provide formal contracts and benefits to employees. This law curbed exploitation of migrant workers, who had been left vulnerable under previous economic policies. While these policies helped reduce inequality, they also slowed economic liberalization, leading to friction between Hu's administration and business elites aligned with Jiang Zemin. Many private entrepreneurs and foreign investors saw Hu's policies as a return to state dominance, raising concerns about China's long-term economic direction. Maintaining political stability, crackdowns, and censorship. Despite his focus on social reforms, Hu Jintao remained highly conservative in political matters. He firmly opposed Western-style democracy emphasizing the absolute authority of the Communist Party. His administration intensified censorship, cracked down on dissidents, and suppressed ethnic unrest. 1. Media censorship and internet control. Hu Jintao expanded China's internet surveillance and censorship mechanisms, reinforcing state control over public discourse. The Great Firewall was strengthened, restricting access to foreign news, social media platforms, and political content. Restrictions on journalists and intellectuals increased, preventing discussions on sensitive topics like Tiananmen Square, Tibet, Taiwan, and human rights abuses. The 2008 Beijing Olympics prompted further crackdowns, with activists and opposition voices being silenced ahead of the event. Hu's policies cemented China's reputation as one of the most tightly controlled media environments in the world. While his government promoted economic and technological progress, it simultaneously ensured that political dissent remained suppressed. 2. Crackdowns on social unrest and ethnic protests. Hu also dealt with significant internal unrest, particularly in regions with large ethnic minority populations. Tibet 2008 Tibetan protests. In March 2008, Tibet witnessed mass protests against Chinese rule, sparked by grievances over religious repression and Han migration. Hu's government responded with harsh crackdowns, sending in thousands of troops to restore order. Xinjiang and Uyghur unrest. Uyghur activists increasingly called for greater autonomy, leading to tightened security and surveillance in Xinjiang. Hu expanded economic incentives for Han Chinese migration to Xinjiang, further fueling ethnic tensions. Although Hu promoted economic development in these regions, his policies of political repression and assimilation contributed to deepening ethnic grievances, which would intensify in the years after his tenure. Foreign policy. China's peaceful rise and growing influence. Hu Jintao's tenure saw China emerge as a dominant global power, with its economic and diplomatic influence expanding across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Unlike Jiang Zemin, who prioritized relations with the West, Hu focused on strengthening China's global position while reducing dependence on Western markets. 1. The peaceful rise strategy. Hu promoted the idea that China's growing power did not threaten the global order, a concept known as China's peaceful rise. He reassured the world that China would avoid direct military confrontation with the U.S. China focused on economic partnerships, infrastructure investments, and diplomatic alliances instead of aggressive military expansion. This strategy helped China gain influence in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, where it provided development aid and investment in exchange for resources. 2. Strengthening ties with developing countries. Hu's government aggressively pursued economic and strategic partnerships with developing nations, particularly in Africa and Latin America. China became Africa's largest trade partner, investing billions in infrastructure projects, mining, and energy resources. Latin America saw a surge in Chinese investments as China secured access to soybeans, oil, and minerals. China's influence in global institutions, such as the UN and G20, increased, allowing it to counterbalance U.S. and Western influence. 3. Rising tensions with the U.S. and Japan. Despite promoting peaceful development, China's rising power inevitably led to geopolitical tensions with the U.S. and its Asian neighbors. U.S.-China relations. China's growing military capabilities, particularly its naval expansion in the South China Sea, raised concerns in Washington. The Taiwan issue remained contentious, with the U.S. continuing to support Taiwan's self-defense. Japan-China relations. Hu's tenure saw several diplomatic disputes with Japan, particularly over territorial claims in the East China Sea. Anti-Japanese protests erupted in 2005, fueled by grievances over Japan's handling of its wartime history. While Hu avoided outright confrontation, it was clear that China's global ambitions were increasingly clashing with Western and regional powers. A leader focused on stability and control. By 2008, Hu Jintao had cemented his legacy as a leader who prioritized economic growth, social stability, and state control. His economic reforms helped reduce inequality, but his political conservatism led to intensified censorship, repression, and ethnic tensions. As China prepared for the 2008 Beijing Olympics, the world saw a nation that had become richer, more powerful, and more assertive, but also one where political dissent was tightly controlled and social tensions simmered beneath the surface. Part 7. The 2008 Beijing Olympics, the global financial crisis, and Hu Jintao's later years in power, 2008-2010. By 2008, Hu Jintao had firmly established himself as China's paramount leader, steering the nation through a period of rapid economic growth and expanding its influence on the world stage. However, the second half of his tenure brought a new set of challenges, including international scrutiny, a global financial crisis, and intensifying domestic unrest. Despite these difficulties, the 2008 Beijing Olympics showcased China's rising global status, while Hu's handling of the financial crisis solidified the country's economic resilience. However, his leadership style, focused on stability, control, and consensus governance, also meant that China's political system remained highly repressive, with no significant moves toward democratization. The 2008 Beijing Olympics, China's grand global showcase, the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing was the largest and most expensive in history at the time, with China spending an estimated $44 billion on infrastructure, stadiums, and preparations. Hosting the Olympics was a major prestige project for Hu Jintao's government, intended to demonstrate China's emergence as a global superpower. 1. Extensive preparations and crackdowns. Hu's government spared no expense in ensuring the success of the Olympics. Key measures included massive infrastructure investments, including the construction of the iconic Bird's Nest Stadium and the expansion of Beijing's subway system. Strict security measures, including heightened surveillance, internet censorship, and mass arrests of dissidents to prevent protests during the Games. Forced evictions, as thousands of Beijing residents were relocated to make way for new Olympic venues. 2. The Tibet protests and the torch relay controversy. In the months leading up to the Olympics, widespread protests erupted in Tibet, with activists demanding greater autonomy and denouncing Chinese repression. The government responded with a harsh crackdown, arresting hundreds and imposing tight media censorship to prevent coverage of the unrest. The Tibet protests fueled global anti-China sentiment, with pro-Tibet activists targeting the Olympic torch relay as it traveled across different countries. In several cities, including London, Paris, and San Francisco, demonstrators disrupted the relay, condemning China's human rights abuses. 3. A successful Olympics amid controversies. Despite the controversies, the 2008 Beijing Olympics were a massive success for China. China won the most gold medals, 51, surpassing the US for the first time. The grand opening ceremony, directed by Zhang Yimou, was widely praised for its spectacular display of Chinese culture and history. The Games cemented China's global image as a rising superpower, boosting national pride and strengthening Hu's domestic legitimacy. However, international concerns over China's political repression did not fade, and the Games highlighted the growing ideological divide between China and the West. The global financial crisis of 2008, China's resilience under Hu. Shortly after the Olympics, the world was hit by the 2008 global financial crisis, which originated in the United States banking system and quickly spread worldwide. The crisis led to economic recessions, collapsing stock markets, and mass layoffs across major economies. But China, under Hu's leadership, managed to weather the storm better than most. 1. The $586 billion stimulus package, 2008-2009. Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao responded swiftly to the crisis, launching a massive economic stimulus package worth 4 trillion yuan, $586 billion, the largest in Chinese history. The package focused on infrastructure spending, highways, railways, airports, boosting domestic demand to counter declining exports, investments in energy, housing, and technological development. This aggressive government intervention prevented China's economy from falling into recession, allowing it to maintain strong GDP growth, 9.4% in 2009, even as the US and Europe suffered economic downturns. 2. China's economic model gains global influence. The crisis exposed weaknesses in Western capitalism, while China's state-led model appeared stronger than ever. Many developing nations look to China as an economic role model, seeing its ability to maintain growth despite global turmoil as proof of the effectiveness of state capitalism. However, the stimulus package also had negative side effects. A surge in debt as local governments borrowed heavily to finance projects. A property bubble, with skyrocketing real estate prices fueled by easy credit. Increased dominance of state-owned enterprises, SOEs, further limiting private sector expansion. Hu's economic policies ensured short-term stability, but they also set the stage for economic challenges that China would face in the next decade, including high local government debt and rising income inequality. Tightening political control. No room for reform. Even as China's economy continued to grow, Hu Jintao remained firmly opposed to political liberalization. Unlike the economic pragmatism of his policies, his approach to governance remained deeply authoritarian. 1. Intensified internet censorship. During this period, Hu's government greatly expanded China's internet control, introducing stricter censorship laws and blocking access to platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. In 2009, after ethnic riots broke out in Xinjiang, the government responded by shutting down internet access in the entire region for 10 months, banning Facebook and Twitter permanently, expanding surveillance programs to track and monitor online activity. These policies laid the foundation for China's modern internet censorship system, further restricting free speech and limiting the influence of foreign media. 2. The crackdown on civil society and dissidents. Hu's government suppressed pro-democracy activists, human rights lawyers, and labor organizers. Among the most notable incidents, the arrest of Liu Xiaobo, 2008, a prominent Chinese intellectual and democracy activist. Liu was detained for his role in drafting Charter 08, a manifesto calling for political reform and human rights. The closure of independent NGOs. Hu's government shut down or severely restricted organizations working on legal rights, labor issues, and freedom of expression. Hu's political crackdowns reinforced his reputation as a cautious and conservative leader, unwilling to tolerate dissent. Foreign policy. Growing tensions with the West. Hu Jintao's later years saw China's foreign relations grow increasingly tense, particularly with the United States and its allies. While Hu initially promoted peaceful development, by 2009-2010, China was becoming more assertive on the world stage. 1. South China Sea disputes. Under Hu, China expanded its claims in the South China Sea, leading to confrontations with Vietnam, the Philippines, and the U.S. Navy. His government increased military patrols in disputed waters, expanded construction on artificial islands to strengthen territorial claims, clashed diplomatically with Southeast Asian nations over maritime boundaries. 2. Deteriorating U.S.-China relations. Hu's government clashed with the Obama administration on multiple fronts, including cybersecurity. U.S. officials accused China of state-backed cyber attacks on American businesses and government agencies. Trade disputes. Tensions escalated over China's alleged currency manipulation and intellectual property theft. Tibet and Taiwan issues. The U.S. criticized China's human rights record, while Beijing condemned American arms sales to Taiwan. Although Hu maintained diplomatic engagement, by 2010, it was clear that U.S.-China relations were shifting toward competition rather than cooperation. Hu Jintao's legacy takes shape. By the end of 2010, Hu Jintao had firmly established China as an economic and geopolitical powerhouse. But his tenure was also marked by rigid political control, rising authoritarianism, and increasing international tensions. As his final years in office approached, questions arose. Would Hu initiate any political reforms before leaving office? How would he handle the growing factional struggles within the CCP? What kind of leader would his successor, Xi Jinping, become? These questions would shape the final phase of Hu Jintao's leadership. Part 8. Hu Jintao's final years in power and the transition to Xi Jinping, 2010-2012. As Hu Jintao's tenure approached its final years, China stood at a crossroads. Under his leadership, the country had become the world's second-largest economy, hosting a successful Beijing Olympics, weathering the 2008 global financial crisis, and expanding its diplomatic and military influence. However, despite economic prosperity, China faced growing domestic and international challenges: corruption, political factionalism, widening inequality, ethnic unrest, and rising tensions with the West. Hu's leadership style, cautious, technocratic, and consensus-driven, had helped maintain stability but also resulted in stagnation in political reforms. As he neared the end of his presidency, pressure grew over China's direction. The rising influence of his successor, Xi Jinping, and Jiang Zemin's lingering political influence, maintaining political stability and economic growth in the final years. Throughout 2010-2012, Hu Jintao's government continued to focus on economic growth, social welfare expansion, and maintaining political stability. However, his administration also faced several major domestic and foreign policy challenges that shaped the final years of his leadership. 1. Economic challenges and the need for reform. While China had recovered from the 2008 financial crisis, its export-driven economic model was becoming unsustainable. Several major issues arose: rising local government debt due to heavy borrowing after the stimulus package, a growing real estate bubble with housing prices soaring beyond affordability, increased income inequality despite welfare expansion. You recognized these problems and sought to shift China's economy toward domestic consumption and innovation, but his limited control over economic policymaking, which remained largely in the hands of Jiang Zemin's allies, meant that large-scale reforms were difficult to implement. 2. Crackdowns on protests and rising social unrest. As Hu neared the end of his term, domestic unrest intensified, particularly in ethnic minority regions and among pro-democracy activists. Xinjiang riots, 2011-2012. Tensions in Xinjiang between Uyghur separatists and Han Chinese led to violent clashes and mass arrests. Wenzhou high-speed rail crash, 2011. A tragic railway accident that killed 40 people sparked public outrage over corruption and mismanagement in infrastructure projects. Increasing internet activism. Despite strict censorship, Chinese netizens became more vocal in criticizing government policies, forcing authorities to expand internet monitoring and content control. 3. Corruption and party infighting intensifies. As the 18th National Congress of the CCP, 2012, which would determine China's next leadership, drew closer, power struggles between political factions intensified. Jiang Zemin's Shanghai clique still dominated economic and military policymaking, limiting Hu's control. Xi Jinping, Hu's designated successor, was gaining influence and building his own power base. Major corruption scandals emerged, including the case of Bo Xilai, a prominent party official who was removed from power in 2012 due to his wife's involvement in the murder of a British businessman. The Bo Xilai scandal shook the CCP's leadership and exposed deep divisions within the party, with different factions fighting for control over China's future direction. The 18th National Congress and the transition to Xi Jinping, 2012. As Hu Jintao prepared to step down, the 18th National Congress of the CCP, held in November 2012, was set to oversee a generational leadership transition. This was a critical moment as it would determine the future direction of China's governance. 1. Xi Jinping becomes China's new leader. At the Congress, Xi Jinping was formally named General Secretary of the CCP, taking over from Hu as China's top political leader. In March 2013, he would also become President of China, completing the transition. Unlike previous leadership transitions, Hu Jintao made a surprising move. He voluntarily stepped down from all positions, including Chairman of the Central Military Commission, CMC. This was significant because both Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin had retained control over the military after leaving the presidency, maintaining influence even after their formal retirement. Hu's decision to fully step down signaled a complete leadership transition, allowing Xi Jinping to assume total control of the party, government, and military without interference. Hu's departure from politics was seen as a break from the precedent of party elders continuing to exert influence. But it also meant that Xi Jinping had a clear path to consolidate his own power, leading to a dramatic shift in China's leadership style in the years to come. Hu Jintao's legacy, a technocratic leader who prioritized stability. By the time Hu Jintao left office, China had transformed into a global economic superpower, but his tenure also left behind unresolved issues that shaped the nation's future. 1. Strengths of Hu Jintao's leadership, sustained economic growth. Under Hu, China overtook Japan to become the world's second-largest economy, 2010. Poverty reduction and social welfare expansion. Policies like healthcare reform, rural tax abolition, and worker protections improved the lives of millions. Avoidance of political chaos. Unlike previous leaders, Hu maintained stability and collective leadership without major purges or factional conflicts. China's rise as a global power. Hu strengthened China's diplomatic influence, expanded trade partnerships, and increased military capabilities. 2. Weaknesses and criticisms of his rule. Lack of political reform. Hu did not introduce any democratic changes and instead tightened censorship and political control. Expansion of the surveillance state, internet censorship, suppression of dissent, and increased surveillance created a more authoritarian system. Failure to curb corruption. Widespread party corruption undermined public trust, and many CCP officials abused their power for personal gain. Rising inequality. Despite welfare improvements, the wealth gap between urban elites and rural poor widened, creating social tensions. Hu Jintao's leadership was often described as cautious, predictable, and collective, but it lacked bold political moves or deep structural changes. His pragmatic but conservative approach kept China stable, but did not resolve the systemic challenges that the country faced. A quiet retirement in the changing political landscape. Unlike Jiang Zemin, who remained active in politics after stepping down, Hu Jintao completely retreated from public life after 2012. He rarely made public appearances and avoided commenting on Xi Jinping's rule, maintaining a low profile. However, in October 2022, Hu Jintao made international headlines when he was unexpectedly removed from the closing ceremony of the 20th National Congress of the CCP. Sitting next to Xi Jinping, Hu was suddenly escorted out by officials, appearing confused and reluctant to leave. Chinese state media later claimed that Hu was unwell, but speculation arose that the incident symbolized Xi Jinping's final rejection of the collective leadership model that Hu had promoted. The event was widely interpreted as a deliberate political signal that the era of consensus rule was over, as Xi had consolidated unprecedented personal authority over the party. Hu Jintao's place in Chinese history. Hu Jintao remains one of the most enigmatic leaders in modern Chinese history. His decade in power was defined by economic expansion and social stability, increased state control and censorship, a cautious bureaucratic leadership style, a smooth transition of power to Xi Jinping. While he did not implement bold reforms, he ensured that China's rise as a global power continued without major disruptions. However, his leadership style contrasts sharply with his successor, Xi Jinping, who quickly dismantled the collective governance model and ushered in an era of strongman rule. Hu Jintao's legacy, therefore, is one of stability without transformation, a period of economic success but political stagnation, where China grew stronger but also became more tightly controlled. Part 9. Hu Jintao's influence on modern China and his relationship with Xi Jinping. Hu Jintao's tenure as China's leader from 2002 to 2012 was defined by economic growth, social stability, and a collective governance model that emphasized consensus-based decision-making. However, his legacy has been significantly overshadowed by his successor, Xi Jinping, whose dramatic departure from Hu's leadership style has reshaped modern China. As China moved into the Xi Jinping era, Hu's policies, leadership approach, and governance philosophy were gradually dismantled or reinterpreted, raising questions about his long-term influence on Chinese politics. Hu Jintao's political and economic influence on modern China. Despite Xi Jinping's shift towards strongman leadership, several key elements of Hu Jintao's policies continue to shape China today. His leadership laid the groundwork for China's sustained rise as a global power, while also contributing to structural challenges that persist under Xi's rule. 1. Economic policies. State control versus market reforms. Hu's economic policies were a blend of state-led growth and controlled market reforms. While he expanded welfare programs and social policies, he also reasserted government control over key industries, particularly state-owned enterprises, SOEs, banking, and infrastructure development. Hu's push for state-led development helped China navigate the 2008 financial crisis, but it also increased debt and reliance on government-backed projects. Under Xi Jinping, this trend intensified, with SOEs playing an even larger role in China's economy and private sector influence being reduced. The property bubble and local government debt crisis, both of which started during Hu's tenure due to his stimulus-driven economic policies, have continued to strain China's economy under Xi. Although Hu's vision was focused on economic stability, his policies also created long-term vulnerabilities, such as over-reliance on infrastructure spending and rising income inequality, which remain major challenges in China today. 2. Political stability versus Xi's power consolidation. Hu Jintao's leadership was built on collective leadership, a system where power was shared among a group of top officials, preventing a single leader from dominating the party. This system reduced internal political conflict by ensuring that major decisions were made through consensus, allowed for a predictable and stable leadership transition, avoiding major political purges. However, under Xi Jinping, this system was completely dismantled. Xi abolished presidential term limits, securing his rule beyond the traditional two-term structure. Rival factions, including those loyal to Hu, were sidelined or purged. The era of collective leadership ended, replaced by a centralized authoritarian model centered on Xi himself. Hu's consensus-driven leadership approach is now widely viewed as a political relic, replaced by Xi's personal dominance over the party, government, and military. 3. Internet censorship and social control. Hu's administration significantly expanded internet censorship, surveillance, and state control over the media, laying the foundation for the modern Great Firewall of China. His government banned Western social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. He expanded internet monitoring and increased state control over the press, preventing open political discussions. His tenure saw mass crackdowns on civil society groups, human rights activists, and intellectuals. Xi Jinping built upon and expanded these policies, introducing more sophisticated surveillance technology, including AI-driven monitoring. The social credit system, which tracks and punishes citizens for behavior deemed untrustworthy. The most advanced state-controlled digital censorship system in the world. While Hu was a key architect of China's modern censorship policies, Xi has taken them to an entirely new level, ensuring that dissent is even more tightly controlled than before. Hu Jintao's relationship with Xi Jinping, a marginalized elder. 1. A quiet retirement, Hu's absence from politics. After stepping down in 2012, Hu Jintao faded into the background, rarely making public appearances or interfering in Xi's rule. Unlike Jiang Zemin, who remained active in politics, Hu truly retired from the political stage. He made a few public appearances at major party anniversaries, such as the CCP's 100th anniversary in 2021. Unlike Jiang, who continued influencing policies behind the scenes, Hu remained silent on Xi's governance. He did not form a political faction or attempt to protect his allies from Xi's purges. However, Xi's rise to absolute power also meant that Hu's influence was systematically erased, with his allies losing positions of authority and his policies being rebranded or abandoned. 2. The 2022 Party Congress incident, a public humiliation. At the 20th National Congress of the CCP, October 2022, Hu Jintao was unexpectedly removed from the closing ceremony, an event that was captured on video and widely circulated online. As he sat next to Xi Jinping, Hu appeared visibly confused when officials approached him. He was escorted out of the room, appearing reluctant to leave, with Xi remaining silent. State media later claimed that Hu was feeling unwell, but many speculated that the removal was politically symbolic. The incident sparked widespread speculation and controversy. Some analysts saw it as a deliberate public humiliation, signaling that Hu's era had ended completely and Xi was erasing any trace of collective leadership. Others argued that it was a genuine health issue, as Hu was already in his 80s in an invisibly weaker condition. Regardless of the true reason, the moment symbolized the transition from Hu's restrained, collective leadership to Xi's absolute authority. It was the final break between the two political eras. Hu Jintao's legacy in modern China. Hu Jintao's leadership is often seen as a bridge between Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms and Xi Jinping's authoritarian consolidation. His time in office was defined by sustained economic expansion, but also debt and inequality issues, political stability, but a lack of major reform, internet censorship and media control, which set the stage for Xi's even harsher restrictions. A collective leadership model which Xi completely dismantled in favor of centralized power. While Hu's influence has largely been erased, his economic policies and governance structures remain deeply embedded in China's political system. Under Xi, China has become more authoritarian, assertive, and centralized, a stark contrast to the cautious, bureaucratic governance of Hu Jintao. The forgotten leader? Today, Hu Jintao is often seen as a transitional figure rather than a visionary leader. His presidency was marked by economic success, but political stagnation, stability, but repression. In many ways, he maintained the status quo rather than reshaping China's future. While his impact on modern China remains undeniable, he has been largely overshadowed by the more dominant and aggressive rule of Xi Jinping. As China continues to evolve under Xi's leadership, Hu Jintao's era is increasingly viewed as a time of missed opportunities, a period where China had the chance to reform politically, but instead chose a path of further authoritarianism. Despite this, his legacy remains intertwined with China's transformation, serving as a critical stepping stone between the reforms of the past and the centralized rule of the present. Part 10, Final Analysis. Hu Jintao's place in history and China's future. After a decade as China's paramount leader, 2002-2012, Hu Jintao left behind a legacy of economic expansion, political stability, and strict governance. Yet in retrospect, his leadership is often overshadowed. His cautious and bureaucratic style pales in comparison to the more dominant figures who preceded and succeeded him, such as Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Xi Jinping. Was Hu Jintao a visionary leader or just a caretaker? In the grand narrative of Chinese history, Hu Jintao is often described as a leader who prioritized stability over transformation. He was not a revolutionary figure like Mao Zedong, nor was he a bold reformer like Deng Xiaoping. Instead, his governance was marked by incremental changes, careful economic management, and political conservatism. The strengths and weaknesses of his leadership help define how history will remember him. The achievements of Hu Jintao's era, China's economic rise to global power status. Under Hu's leadership, China's GDP quadrupled, surpassing Japan in 2010 to become the world's second largest economy. He maintained high economic growth while expanding welfare policies to improve rural and low-income living standards. His policies made China a dominant global trading power, increasing its influence across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Expansion of China's technological and infrastructure power. China developed a vast high-speed rail network, modernizing its transportation system. Hu's government invested heavily in science, technology, and renewable energy, laying the foundation for China's future innovation boom. His state-controlled economic model strengthened key industries, ensuring China's dominance in sectors like manufacturing, energy, and telecoms. Political stability and smooth leadership transition. Hu Jintao avoided major political crises, ensuring a smooth transition of power to Xi Jinping in 2012. His collective leadership model prevented strong factionalism, even though corruption remained rampant. Unlike previous transitions, such as Deng Xiaoping's power struggles with Mao's loyalists, Hu's exit from power was orderly. China's increased global influence. Under Hu, China emerged as a global superpower, strengthening ties with Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia. His peaceful rise strategy helped China expand economically without provoking direct military conflicts. He strengthened China's military and naval presence, laying the foundation for its future geopolitical assertiveness under Xi Jinping. The failures and criticism of Hu Jintao's leadership, lack of political reform and increased authoritarianism. Hu had opportunities to introduce political reforms, but instead he intensified party control over society. He expanded censorship, internet restrictions, and state surveillance, setting the stage for China's modern digital authoritarianism. His government's crackdowns on Tibet, Xinjiang, and pro-democracy movements showed that he was committed to control, not openness. Failure to address corruption and factionalism. The Bolshoi scandal, 2012, exposed widespread corruption within the CCP, undermining trust in the party. His inability to curb elite corruption allowed the rise of powerful political cliques, which Xi Jinping later used to justify his anti-corruption purge. Corruption in state-owned enterprises, SOEs, flourished, leading to wasteful spending and economic inefficiencies. Widening wealth gap and economic challenges. While Hu improved social welfare, wealth inequality in China worsened significantly. His 2008 stimulus package created a massive debt problem, which later led to local government financial crises. The housing market bubble, which expanded under Hu's policies, became a major challenge for China's economy in the following decades. Lost opportunity for democratic development. Hu's administration could have introduced political reforms, but he chose to reinforce party rule instead. His crackdown on intellectuals, activists, and civil society groups limited China's ability to develop an independent legal or political system. His refusal to allow even moderate political liberalization meant that China moved further away from democratic reforms. Hu's legacy sits between Jiang Zemin and Xi Jinping. He was not as aggressive in reforms as Deng, but not as authoritarian as Xi. His leadership style was predictable, structured, and stability-focused, lacking the charismatic vision of Mao, Deng, or even Xi. His cautious and reserved nature meant that he avoided controversy, but he also failed to make lasting reforms. What Hu Jintao's era means for China's future. Even though Hu Jintao's political influence has faded, his leadership still shapes modern China in many ways. 1. The shift from collective leadership to Xi Jinping's dominance. Hu represented the last era of collective leadership, where power was shared within the Politburo Standing Committee. Xi Jinping completely dismantled this model, consolidating absolute power and ending the consensus rule of previous administrations. 2. The expansion of authoritarian control. Hu Jintao increased censorship and surveillance, but his governance was still bureaucratic and collective. Xi Jinping took Hu's policies to the extreme, creating a highly centralized surveillance state where dissent is nearly impossible. 3. The legacy of economic growth and structural challenges. Hu oversaw one of the fastest periods of economic growth in history, but he also left China with deep economic problems, including debt, inequality, and industrial over-reliance on state control. His state-dominated economic model remains influential, as China today still relies on government-driven growth rather than full market reforms. Final verdict: how will history remember Hu Jintao? Hu Jintao will likely be remembered as a leader who preserved stability, managed economic growth, but failed to introduce lasting reforms. He was a stabilizer, not a reformer. His policies ensured China's rise, but also reinforced authoritarian control. His legacy is fading as Xi Jinping reshapes China's political system. In contrast to Mao, the revolutionary, Deng, the reformer, and Xi, the strongman, Hu Jintao will be remembered as the quiet technocrat who oversaw a rising China but missed opportunities to shape its long-term future. His reserved, consensus-driven leadership style, once seen as a strength, is now seen as a relic of a bygone era, overtaken by Xi Jinping's dominant, centralized rule. As China continues to evolve, Hu's legacy may ultimately be seen as the calm before the storm, a period of stability that preceded the most dramatic power shift in modern Chinese history.